Well, welcome everybody to tonight's session for the Fabian Society on markets for a greener China. The idea for this session for me dates back to when Mary and I and others visited China in 2004 as part of a delegation to the party in China. And we were taken to the Loess Plateau to see a development there, which is a massive desert where compacted sand with people living in caves dug in the clefts. And my memory of, and we were shown a development program to bring people up to the surface, but having watched and taken an interest in China over the years, my understanding is that plateau is now being gradually forested with a massive tree planting program throughout the whole of China. And my memory of the time we were there was in the faces, the difference in the faces of the parents and the children. The parents were in their 40s, their faces had lines and cracks in them almost as deep as the ones in the Loess Plateau, but the children had unlined, fresh faces, and for me it's stuck in my memory as a indicator of the possibilities of, and the final thing for me to say is it's always been my belief that our greatest hope in terms of the issues of climate change is going to be when China decides to push the button. And the thing about the Chinese is they have plans that they not only formulate, but they also intend to implement. So it was with that we invited, Jason Young, who's given a presentation, suggested that Alex Lowe would be a good person to talk to us. And as you can see, Alex is a senior lecturer at the university here in environmental issues and also an adjunct professor at Guangzhou University in China. So I'm very much looking forward to your presentation, Alex, and please welcome him now.
First of all, I appreciate Mike and also the Fabian Society for inviting me to talk about China's environmental policy. I've been in New Zealand for only 2.5 years. Before that, I was working in Hong Kong and Australia. So this is pretty much the first time I am given the opportunity to share what I know about China, its environmental policy, and in particular, the climate change policy and the progress in more recently after or before the COP26. So, before I introduce my talk, show you a picture here. Obviously, you see people wearing face masks. In these days, we are not surprised by people doing this in every part of the world, including China and New Zealand. Guess why they did that? All right, not pandemic, not health. The picture, I suppose, was taken several years ago, and I assume about 7 or 8 or even longer years before. So if you've been in China, especially the major, larger industrialized cities, about 7 or 8 years ago, and in the late 90s, that's what you may see, especially in places like Guangzhou, Beijing, larger cities, close to industrialized center, the air pollution was so severe that you don't see anything. So these are some of the pictures that taken in major cities. Those are not water vapor, they are smoke, so toxic gas. You don't want to breathe. But people had to live with the air pollution issue for several years until recently. All right? So air pollution was one of the major or most visible environmental problems in China during 90s to 2010s. Visible doesn't mean it was the most severe environmental problems. There are a lot of different sort of environmental problems in the country, including in the rural area, also including those we don't see it using with our eyes, such as the CO2, we can't see them. So, China has gone through several decades of industrialization. very rapid economic growth, but at the same time, they've got a lot of environmental problems, including this one, air pollution, water pollution. Some of the problems that I'm going to talk about, including this one, has something to do with the use of fossil fuels, which obviously contribute to climate change as well. However, China's environmental quality has improved. If we take a longer time frame, like from 60s, 70s up to the present time, the environmental quality has really improved. The approach that the government's been using for dealing with environmental policy has also changed. There is a transition process if we started at 1980s to the present time. The new directions in dealing with environmental problems include the use of market-based approaches, which is one thing that I will focus on. But if you ask me whether they've been effective in overcoming environmental challenges, I think it's quite hard to tell, as I will talk about later on. So, today, I will give a brief or a very brief history of environmental protection in China, because the time frame that I'm going to use here will start from the 50 and 60 to the present time. So given the scale of environmental problems and also the size of the country, it has to be very brief. The use of market-based approach, I do want to have a focus, which is one thing that I am familiar with, and especially when comparing with the early years before the market-based approach was adopted, and also focusing a little bit more on response to climate change. There are a lot of reasons for focusing on climate change. We just had the COP26 a couple of weeks ago, and it was one of the major international events in negotiating environmental, especially climate change problems. So these are something that I will cover. All right? Just in case, if you didn't know much about China, so here is a quick comparison with New Zealand. We know that China is still a developing country, so the GDP per capita is still several times lower than New Zealand and certainly in other major developed economies. Population is obviously China's is one of the largest, it's actually the largest country by population, and we are a small economy in the OECD. The third one is a little bit contested about how we call China developing countries or a developed or becoming a developed economy. Some people disagree on that. New Zealand is a high-income country, developed economies. China, technically, according to World Bank's classification, is still a middle-income country, but at the top end. And if you compare, especially China, the current economic sort of a capacity, it's been much higher than other major emerging economies, such as India, Brazil. So China has much greater economic resources and capacity than those other larger developing countries. So some people tend to put China as a kind of like sitting between a developed and developing countries. But one thing that we can probably accept is that it's certainly at the top end of developing countries. The form of political economy, we are familiar with New Zealand. Obviously, we have a liberal market here. The economy is pretty open. China is a little bit complicated. In terms of the market economy, it's been being opened, especially starting from the 1980s. But you won't call it a liberal market economy because politically, the system is still inheriting some of the legacies from socialism. So that is the political institutions, political system. But in terms of the market economy, I think it's been more open than in the past. In the past mean before the 80s. So, to start with, 1950 to 70s, the ways in which environmental problems were understood was quite different from what we see today, and also the form of environmental problem as well. So 50s to 70s, it was the time where China was still pretty much controlled by the socialist regime, central planning regime. Chairman Mao once he believed that people had the ability to conquer nature. All right, that's what he said in Chinese. And also his party mobilized people, especially in villages, in the rural areas. And one of the things, or one of the political campaigns that his party initiated was the Great Leap Forward campaign. So without going into details about this political movement, I just want to point out one thing is that because this campaign or movement involved a lot of industrialization processes using a lot of natural resources, and it kind of like contributed to a series of environmental disasters. There was a industrialization process, massively resource intensive, creating environmental problems such as waste dumping in ecologically sensitive areas, air pollution from iron and steel production, and also deforestations. And the problem was framed as the environment or nature as an enemy to development. So, and so the Chinese people must conquer the nature in order to develop, and in particular, in order to stand against the US and the UK. So that was the ideology back in the socialist time before 70s. But things changed quickly, and it didn't really last long. I mean, the environmental disaster and the campaigns. So in late 70s, about 78 or 79, after the passing of Chairman Mao, there was a new government. There was a new campaign and also a new nationwide strategy. Nationwide restart, basically a very large scale, important and far-reaching political economic sort of movement, which is called Reform and Open Up. So that was pretty much more about the economy, the economic system becoming more open, liberalized during especially the early 80s. However, that was more about the economy. The political system and institutions, to a large extent, still remain to be inheriting the central planning regime, certainly about the environmental regulatory systems. So there was industrialization, some pollution. So the government started to realize they have to do something about the environmental issues. However, during that time, because of the legacy of the central planning regime, there was not much public and private sector involvement, relatively limited participation by the public, environmental NGOs or environmental movement, and certainly not much limited response to international environmental agreement. So the central state, in this case, was the central government playing a major role. And also there was a reliance on technology. So it was back in 80s. But I have to say, this is not unique to China. Many countries, including some Western countries, many years ago, so you can imagine it could be like 50s or 60s, experienced something like that, all right? Relying on the government, relying on technologies, relatively limited public involvement. There was a time where many countries experienced something similar. So China had the same during that time, top-down big government. Then, 80s, mid 80s, late 80s, and the early 90s. Economic growth was much faster. At that time, the GDP was not particularly high. It was more like the economy building the basis, building the foundation, both in terms of the people, institution, this sort of a technological foundation for further economic growth that we saw in the next decades. So the economy was growing, but at the same time we also saw more environmental issues, problems, especially pollution, especially those related to industrialization, industrial pollution, and in some cases, in many cases, in the urban area as well. Slightly different from the 2 decades ago, which was more rural and at the village level. Toxic air, toxic water, and the solid waste. So these were the typical forms of environmental issue back in those times. And one of the very severe environmental issue was acid rain from the burning of fossil fuels. That basically means some of the toxic air pollutants such as NO2, sulfur dioxide, and nitrogen oxides going to the air, increasing the acidity of the water on the sky and then falling on the ground as rains. Those rains could contribute to the rusting, such as the picture you see here down here, damaging buildings, damage affecting human health, and also agriculture. The acid rain issue, as I remember when I studied as a student, was also one of the most important environmental issues in Europe. So that was, if I remember correct, about 60s, 50s, or 70s. So this is one of the very typical form of environmental problems arising from industrialization.
Does that include soil?
Which one?
You mentioned air, water, and solid waste. Does that cover soil?
I think so, because obviously there was also a lot of wastewater going into the grounds and potentially flowing into farms as well. So that could happen, and also considering some of the industrial activities were close to those agriculture areas. It's actually still the case, I would say. So one of the things that the government has done, obviously, it was close to 90s. The government, especially the central government, already realized they've got to do something about it. Seeing the damages on health, agriculture, and buildings, they increased their institutional capacity, upgrading, for example, their key environmental protection agency, which was state or national environmental protection agency, being upgraded to state or environmental protection bureau being upgraded to agency. That means higher level in the government structure. And then in the next few years and next few decades, further being upgraded to a ministry, and such a process going on. And also more employees in the environmental protection agencies. They strengthened their ability to enforce laws and also introduce more environmental law as well. So what we see here is a change in the way that the environmental issue was understood. Environmental problems are now seen as a threat to economic growth, and not exactly as in the past, where the environment itself was seen as a threat. That was in the socialist China. So things change, starting from 80s. In the 90s, the government continued to make more investment in environmental protection. One of the data that I found, not very updated, was this. Environmental investment started increasing from the 90s. You can see I actually put up this red line here in the middle. the picture comes from a academic publication. So we can see here from 90s, let's say from 1991, the absolute amount of environmental investment has gone up. And it's not just about the environmental investment, the absolute amount, but also as a percentage of GDP, especially starting from the late 90s. So that was another change that I'm going to talk about in a minute in the late 90s. But from early 90s, what we saw here is an increase in environmental investment. But putting more money doesn't mean a really dramatic change in the organizational approach or institutional approach. One of the things that we observed, again, is actually not unique to China, is the use of, or intensive use of, command and control approach. What do you mean by command and control approach? It's actually the opposite, or not opposite, the alternative to market-based approach. Means relying on the use of laws, standards, quotas, bans, and penalties for violations. But that doesn't mean, obviously, every government uses these tools as well. The main difference here is that relying on those instruments, all right? Unlike what you might see here in New Zealand, we've been using a mix of environmental policy instruments, obviously including this, but we also have a range of market-based policy instruments as well. However, back in the early 90s, the focus, the main approach was still command and control. But that will start to change a few years later. So the environmental policy making approach, I would say, was still hierarchical. All right, as I said, inheriting the legacy of central planning regime, still not yet changed it, and there was a organizational arrangement. For example, to illustrate that, there was an organizational arrangement where the local level environmental protection bureaus in China, every major local government, including province levels, city levels, they have their own environmental policy bureaus, EPBs. These local EPBs are highly dependent on their counterpart at the national government level. So that is the state or national environmental protection administration or agency. So that means the central government's environmental protection agency could influence the decision of the local level's EPBs, all right? And to extend that, even in some cases, they could actually instruct the local level counterparts to do things for the environment or not. It's slightly different from things here we see in, for example, in New Zealand. It's not easy for the MFE, Ministry for the Environment, to ask an environmental protection unit at the Wellington Council to do something. That is much more difficult. But under the organizational structure in China, that's possible. Still the case. So that is one legacy of probably a central planning agency, different sort of organizational arrangement, demonstrating sort of the different approach. So when I say things are getting changed, there are also some things not being changed, such as this. Okay, and also at the same time, as I said, it was pretty much dominated by the central government, or more generally, the government, right, at different levels. The private sector didn't really have a strong role in environmental protection. It's unlike what we see today, even in China. I'm not going to talk too much about the private sector, but one thing that I'm quite sure is that the private sector, including both the SOE, state-owned enterprises, have become more active in environmental areas, also including climate change as well. 90s to 2000s. This is it was a turning point. That's how I see it. The late 1990s to early 2000s. It was not just a change in the environmental policy approach, but also in the forms of environmental problems that the government saw as the most important thing, starting to change. And if you are familiar with China's economy, that was also the time where we saw explosive growth in the economy. So many big changes happening starting from the 90s or early 2000s. So, for example, I mentioned the EPBs, the local environmental protection units. From late 90s, they started to get more freedom in setting their environmental regulations, in financing, and also in making their own institutional arrangements. And it was also the time where the central government started to realize the traditional command and control approach was not perfect. So they started it was actually a larger change, a broader change in the society. It's not just in environmental area. There was a process of decentralization where the central government sharing more power, resources, and opportunities for the local level governments to manage the environment, and also in other areas as well, such as social well-being, and also in the management of NGO, this sort of a social aspect. It was a wider, broader change in the society in the environmental protection area, simply reflecting this sort of a broader change in the Chinese society. So the decentralization does not mean environmental improvements. It only meant a different approach in dealing with the environment. And in particular, what actually happened and what we actually observed is that both tendencies of decentralization and centralization coexisting at the same time, even continue to be the case in the present time. So I mentioned decentralization, giving more power to local levels, government, and also organization outside the government. But at the same time, also seeing the government tightening the control over some key aspects or some certain ways of managing the environment. For example, in the recent years, it's not just the 90s, but also the case currently as well, where the local level government, senior government officials, including, for example, the mayor or the chiefs of the local provinces, if they want to get a promotion, they would need to meet some targets, I would say hot targets. For example, if the central government now asking a province or the mayor, chief, executives to reduce their CO2 or SO2 by 20%, if the government official is not able to do that, they might not get promotions. So this is what I call hot target. And to some extent, I think it's still the case currently, as I heard about climate change mitigation. So these sort of hard targets are still being used. And this is obviously giving the power, or the central government retaining the power and actually tightening that part of the sort of a arrangement for managing the environment. I can't tell whether this was effective because we see mixed outcomes. But one thing that I want to point out here is that it was a transition from highly centralized approach to more decentralization. But at the same time, we also see some other top-down controls being strengthened. Another thing that is quite clear is that there was a more engagement by the international environmental negotiations, meetings, and also those sort of processes, most obvious in the areas of climate change. So, market-based approach. I mentioned the late 1990s was a turning point. This is one way to understand that transition and the turning point. It's the use of market-based approach for dealing with environmental issues. There are different forms of market-based approach, which is something that I will talk about in my class. But to give a sort of a quick overview about what's been used in China since the late 1990s, the first category, pollution levies and charges. There are all sort of different types of charges, pollution levies, in many countries, including in New Zealand as well. So they come in different forms. The second one is quite unique and interesting as well. I don't actually study the PES, Payment for Ecosystem Services. Basically, the idea is that somebody, which is usually the government, paying the people, especially farmers or landowners, and then to pay them some money in exchange for their protecting the environment or their land. One of the most well-known initiatives, nationwide program, is Grant for Grain, which is, I think, still currently operating. Grant for Grain, also known as Conversion of Croplands to Forest Program. Farmers are given an option to be paid to return their land for reforestation. I don't actually do a lot of study into this PES program, but it looks like, at least from some data that I found from the World Bank, the forest area, for example, as a percentage of total land area, has been increasing from 90s to 2010s. But it wasn't really a big jump if you look at that, 70% to 23. But at least you can see a straight line there. So that means it was a continual improvement. I can't tell whether it was driven by that program, but one thing which is quite encouraging is that, obviously, the forest area has been increasing, which is great. All right? Another form of market-based approach is trading. More specifically, it's the trading of pollution rights, or the rights to pollute, including SO2, sulfur dioxide, and CO2. CO2 is more important. I will cover that towards the end of this lecture, the presentation. SO2 came actually earlier than CO2. A lot of people think that China has introduced a carbon dioxide trading, and it was the first attempt to use that policy approach for dealing with the environment. That was not correct. Actually, it was the SO2. As I said, in the 90s, air pollution was the most important issues, or most visible, especially in larger cities where many people lived, including government officials. So they started dealing with SO2 using market-based approach from the late 90s or the early 2000s. To give a brief introduction about what it means, this policy approach, SO2 trading means the government, usually the government, but it doesn't have to be the government, issuing a fixed number of permits to pollute. You could understand this sort of permits to pollute as a legal license to pollute. And that means if you run a power plant, because power plants are the major source of SO2 and air pollutants, if you run a power plant, and obviously that would mean you generate some SO2, if you want to continue to operate that plant, you would need to usually buy these permits, sometimes we call it allowance, from the market or from the government, obviously at a cost. All right, so that is a market-based approach. And when you buy or sell, you could do that in the market. all right, specific formal market for trading SO2 emission permits or allowances. So market-based approach. Mostly in coal mining cities and provinces. It wasn't really a nationwide policy program, only in some of those countries. If I remember correctly, if you look at this map, the black dots shows the location of the power plants, mostly in the eastern coast and also in the central north. As I remember, the SO2 policy program was implemented in those some of those areas, not the entire country, not even the entire provinces, if I remember correct. Now, that is one thing that is quite interesting is that it was a learning process. On one hand, learning to run a new policy approach and learning from another country. In this case, it was from the United States, because in early or mid-90s, the United States was very successful in running a SO2 program for dealing with acid rain. So China sent a delegate to the US to learn about how to run its SO2, and then brought the ideas back to China. And then a couple of years later, they really set up a SO2 trading program. It was from 2001. However, from the research that I saw, it wasn't really successful in the first few years of implementation. There were a lot of issues. Those issues include, for example, there was too much intervention by the government, because if you want to run a market for SO2 emissions allowances, you need to empower or enable the market to do some things that the government used to do. However, it was early 2000s where the governments, especially local level government, they didn't really have high capacity for running something that they had no idea. So they used their traditional approach, closely working with the private companies to an extent that there was too much interventions into this market and also into the operation on this program, leaving the market a very small role to play, which is not what we expected. There are also other reasons. So mostly about the government sort of not being able to handle that, but again, that changed. A few years later, from 2007, things getting better, and if I am correct, I think they are still operating at this stage. But because SO2, air pollution, is only a local or regional environmental problems, so it wasn't a really large scale, a big and major program. Here comes climate change. All right. We know that we had the COP26 a couple of weeks ago, and the COP26 was an annual event for countries to negotiate on climate change solutions. 26 means there have been 26 meetings in the past 26 years, actually 27. It's under the UNFCCC. Climate change is important issue for our discussion here, because as some of you might know, China is the largest greenhouse gas emitter in the world. Anything that China has done or not going to do about the CO2 is going to make a lot of impact on our progress in overcoming the climate change challenge. Oops. A little bit statistic. This is updated information. I didn't state a year, but the pie chart must be updated. China contributes 28% of, I think it's CO2 or greenhouse gas. They are different, but whatever. I think it's going to be similar. 28% of the world's CO2 emissions, much better, more than the second one, which which is the United States, 15%, nearly doubling, and also much more than the second largest developing countries, India, which is 7% only. Earlier, I mentioned that people might disagree on whether putting China as really a developing countries or emerging going to be a developed countries. Another way to see it is the amount of emissions, CO2 emissions. This is 2018, the table on the right-hand side, per person, CO2 emission from fuel combustions. Data from the International Energy Agency updated. China 6.84. China is technically a developing country, but the per capita emissions are much, much greater than other major emerging economies, such as Brazil, less than 2, India, less than 2, Indonesia, a little bit over 2, all right? Several times more than them, all right? These are large major economies in the developing world, but China emissions per capita is much greater, and not even mention the total amount of greenhouse gas emissions. What about comparing with developed economies? We are doing quite well, even though we keep blaming our government for not doing much about climate change. But in fact, our per capita emissions, CO2, has been much lower than our neighbors, for example, Australia, the US, a little bit higher than the European Union, but still at a range of 6 to 7. But if you look at compare with China, greenhouse gas emissions are obviously much higher than us. Still lower than Australia and US, but higher than some OECD countries and developed economy, including New Zealand and the European Union, and also higher than some major developing countries. So that's why I said, in terms of climate change greenhouse gas contribution, China is actually sitting between developed and developing countries. More recently, if you might have seen something from media where the last minute changed, driven by India, but it was actually supported by several other emerging developing countries, and that include China. Changing the wording from phasing out coal to phasing down, personally, I don't think it will make a difference, all right? It's just rhetoric. But media capture that, but that is another thing that I could talk about for a day. One thing that I just want to point out here, why? It's not difficult to see why, because China relies on coal. Comparing with New Zealand is not a fair comparison because New Zealand stands out in terms of our ability to mobilize renewable energy. The share of coal and gas in power generation last year, China had over 70%. We had less than 20%. We had nearly 80% of our electricity from renewables. China had only 22. It looks like a not very impressive number, 22.4, but I will show you in a minute. There was a very dramatic change in the capacity for generating renewable energies in China, a very positive and encouraging change. So, but on the other hand, one thing that you can see from this graph is the electricity generation by source, by coal, hydro, renewable energies, nuclear. There has been smaller share of electricity from coal burning. If we take a time frame of like 30 years, especially in the recent years, past 10 years, the percentage of coal being used for generating electricity has gone down. And at the same time, I will show you a little bit more details, statistics there. Solar, wind, and hydro have been increasing, and solar in particular was really a dramatic change. Another thing that I would point out is nuclear. All right, I will show you another table which is clear. This is the big picture. China has been reducing coal, but as you can see, that still accounts for a very large part of their energy mix. So what was the outcome in terms of climate change, greenhouse gas emissions? Both positive and negatives. Look at the past 10 years or 8 years. From 2012, CO2 emissions, the total amount, were increasing until 2015, 14. Then we saw a slow reductions in the CO2 emissions for about 3 years until 2017. From 2017, the CO2 emissions have been increasing. I don't know about last year. I tried to get an update for last year, but we haven't. They haven't got the update information. But I imagine the CO2 will rise last year because of COVID, because of China recovering much faster than other countries. So the industrial processes should be moving forward. So that's what I expected. Just a little bit about the distribution of CO2 emission, not updated information, but I think the back picture remains the same. Most of the emissions, as you might have also seen from my earlier graph, that obviously come from power plants mostly, and also come from heavy industries. And this industry and power plants are concentrated in the northern part of the country, eastern coast. So that's why you see more emissions from this region, the northern, the eastern, and also the central northern. All right? Policy response. China has been dealing with climate change issues from the early 90s, but as a developing countries, and also one of the developing countries, and obviously not yet becoming the major player in climate change. So China ratified the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, which is the organizer of COPs conferences, in '92. In the 90s, China saw climate change as a technical issue. Here, it wasn't different from the ways that they dealt with other environmental issues. Equally or similarly seeing environmental issue as a technical issue, as a scientific issue. How do we know? One of the indications that we saw was that climate change policy at that time was coordinated by a meteorological agency, all right? Obviously a technical unit, not a strategic sort of economic or political institutions. A few years later, 1998, a major development agency took over the policy coordination responsibilities, and that marked another major change in the policy approach and policy framing. It was the NDRC, National Development and Reform Commission. In China, the organizational structure is that commission stands at a higher level than ministries, then agency, administration, and then bureau. So climate change being managed by a commission, and also given that this commission manages a whole range of important policy portfolios, social development, economic planning. Those are what I would call strategic important areas. And that also means climate change was coordinated by an important and powerful agency. Unfortunately, they, about 3 or 4 years ago, they hand over the climate change portfolio to a ministry, lower level. But that was another story, which I won't cover. Early 2000s, China started framing climate change as a national development issue, so not just a technical or scientific issue. Climate change was strategically linked with economic growth and energy security. This is, I think, still the case at the present time, where the climate change has been given a strategic importance, being seen as a threat to growth. The small difference here is that is no longer just a threat to or damage on buildings, farms, and people health. Here, it's more strategic. The scope became much broader. Economic growth, and I would even say it's not just about the economy, but the nation, right? Economy, society, right? This sort of a broader scope. So it's been, climate change has been elevated to a higher strategic level, starting from 2000s. I said, late 1990s and early 2000s was a turning point. We know that many of those changes are driven by their economic capacity. It was also quite clear that from 2000, we see very fast GDP economic growth since 2000, and that changed many things. One of the things being changed is the amount of CO2 being generated. So, now China started feeling pressures from the international climate community. Even though in 2002, China ratified the Kyoto Protocol was a very important international climate change agreement before the Paris Agreement. So Paris Agreement is more like a new one, where the Kyoto was the old one. In 2009, China openly rejected any binding emission reductions targets, claiming that it's still a developing country is the case. But it kind of like reflects the attitude towards the call for climate action by Western countries being quite defensive and hostile. So one of the indications, for example, at COP15, so that was another UNFCCC climate change meetings. It was in Copenhagen, critical event like COP26. In this conference, the Chinese premier walked out of a key meeting and sent a second-tier diplomat to meet with the president of the US, Obama. It was a political gesture, showing that their very defensive and hostile attitude towards the Western countries' call for action. But that changed. After that, it wasn't only about, or not even mainly about, that Copenhagen conference, but also because by 2009, it became very clear that China would become, or has already become, the world's largest greenhouse gas emitter. If I remember correctly, data show it was 2007, where China surpassing the United States, becoming the largest greenhouse gas emitter. So that's why people pointed their fingers to China. And China felt a lot of pressures, both during the 2009 conference and after. But also at that point, which is perhaps a positive change, that China became more active and cooperative in the international climate policy space. There are a lot of reasons. Pressures are one reason, but we know that the Chinese government is very resilient to international pressures, so that just couldn't be the only reason. Another reason is that the Chinese government takes their national reputation very serious, and they do want to achieve global leadership in many different areas. Environmental areas or environmental leadership is relatively easier to achieve for China to achieve than other more controversial issues such as human rights, social equity, and democratization. So global environmental leadership is really one thing the Chinese government is keen on doing, and so far has been really doing something great, I would say. But also there are also some challenges and negatives, as I will show you later. One of the great things, or positive things, is a couple of commitments. It was 2015, a few years after the Copenhagen conference. the US and China came to a agreement or a consensus in which there was a joint statement. And China pledged to lower CO2 emission per unit of GDP by 60 to 65%. Remember, this is per unit of GDP. We call it carbon intensity. I would call it, this is not a very strong target, but remember, and also introducing a national ETS, emission trading system. But I would say, remember, these commitments came after 2 decades of austerity and resistance to serious action. So that is a big thing comparing with their traditional sort of approaches and attitudes. There are 2 major achievements from my perspective in the climate change areas. One is renewable energy. The other is carbon emission trading. They are related. Carbon emission trading contributes to renewable energy development in China. So I did say that China has really demonstrated their ability to produce renewable energies, and that is true from data. For example, if you look at this graph, where's China? China is up down here, all right? That's account for 30% of the world's total renewable energy generated. And I can't remember which year, it could be in 2018, all right? Much more than the European Union, several times more than the United States, and obviously other countries as well. So that was, still is the #1 country in generating renewable energy. Guess which renewable energy types China has contributed more in the past 10 years? Hydro. Solar. So, the solar, hydro, and also wind as well. So I think later on I will show you another table, show you the percentage changes. But solar was really remarkable, the growth in solar powers. If you look at this graph, 2018, comparing with, for example, 2011, you can't even see the yellow color. Yellow color represents China's contributions to renewable solar energy productions. Negligible before 2012, and when it comes to 2018, I think it has over 40% of the world's share, and that's really dramatic. And I have to say, it's not just the energy, but also the technology and the courses as well. Think about it. China has developed so many capacities for generating solar. That would include the people, the expertise, skills, technology, and also reducing the costs as well, potentially benefiting other countries who are also doing the same, generating solar. If you look at the data, solar energy generation, the costs of solar energy power generation have gone down quite dramatically in the past 5 years or 10. I think China contributed to that as well. So, table showing the annual percentage change in installed electricity generating capacity. I have said quite a lot of good things about renewable energy here. There is actually some negative as well. Look at that. Past 10 years, annual percentage change. Coal-fired generation continue to increase, small percentages, but you don't see a sign of decreasing, right? 5, 2, 5, 4, 3, 4, 4.7. As I said, I imagine last year is likely to be a little bit up. Not just coal. Look at the third one, nuclear. All right, and from an environmental perspective, nuclear energy is really the last option that we want to use for climate change mitigation. Low emission, but there are a lot of concern about health, environmental, and also for people as well. So you can see the percentage over the past 5 years continue to rise, even though smaller percentage than solar. Solar was crazy So you can see the percentage, double digits, and also wind as well. Hydro, China does have strong capacity. If you look at one of the graphs I show you, hydro was actually the largest renewable energy types, but it was historical, all right? Historically, they built a lot of hydropower plants in the past. Not much more additional capacity in the past 10 years. The additional capacity mostly came from solar and second, wind. But as I said, we also see more coal-fired generation and nuclear as well, which is not great. Market mechanism for reducing CO2. The Kyoto Protocols has a market-based mechanism, which is the CDM, mainly a clean development mechanism from 2005, mainly for developing countries. The mechanism works by allowing and encouraging developing countries, including China, to get their emission reductions certified. What I mean is that China and also other developing countries could reduce their emissions, CO2, by, for example, building a wind turbines, planting trees, or building a biogas facility like that one on the top. And then, through a process, certify these emission reductions. Somebody will buy it. Industrialized countries, including New Zealand, buy these emission reductions to fulfill their commitments under the Kyoto Protocol. As I remember, New Zealand also bought many emission reductions, not from China, but from transitional economies like the Ukraine. But that was New Zealand. China is the largest exporter and also producers of these emission reductions. Sometimes we call it carbon offset, so you could understand this sort of CDM thing is a carbon offsetting mechanism. China is the biggest player. This graph or maps is from me, so that is my research, but not yet published. It shows China actually benefit most from the CDM, comparing with other developing countries. But I have to say, it's not just about the money. Largest market share, yes, but on the other hand, there are also a lot of international flows of human capital, knowledge, skills, technologies, and also building institutional confidence and capacity. Remember I said earlier, the SO2 trading wasn't really a great success. Part of the reason is that the institutions and also the government people and also private sector as well, were not very familiar with trading. And CDM was one of the big mechanisms that helped the institution to build their confidence and capacity. This is important because in the next couple of slides, I will tell you, China has actually set up their own version of CDM, which benefited very much from the CDM experience. So it was from failure to hostility, to strong advocate and leadership. Failure, such as the SO2 trading, hostility in international negotiations, and more recently, strong advocate of market-based approach, especially for climate change, and also taking leadership, given their large contribution to climate change or greenhouse gas emissions. Whatever they do, including what I'm going to talk about, emission trading, is going to make a difference if done well. So, putting a price on carbon, some of you might know that we here in New Zealand also have put a price on carbon through our NZ ETS starting from 2008. China, as a developing country, started only in 2013, but it was not really too late, because it was the first developing countries to introduce a number of emission tradings in different cities and provinces. Along with this ETS at the local levels, there was also what I just mentioned, Chinese version of CDM, and that is not an international mechanism. It is for China only. Carbon offsetting, very similar in every aspect to the CDM. So that's what I said, a very clear learning process going on. in the 90s, it was learning from the US, and then in the mid-2000s, learning from the international. And then a national ETS was launched in December 2017. I highlight politically because it was quite interesting. That launch was symbolic. So the policy program was launched, but nothing happened. It's a little bit confusing. That just means the government declared they've set up an ETS. There was no trading, no market, no one being regulated until early this year. All right? Early this year, there was actual operation covering the power sector. So, positives about this ETS. One of the very encouraging things is that it covers about 40% of the whole country's CO2. That's quite a lot, all right? And also considering China's share of CO2, 28%, 40% of this 28%, that could mean over 10% of global emissions being covered by one single ETS. That's quite a lot. Incentivizing the private sector, that's straightforward. You put a price on carbon, then the private sector will certainly have to respond. Then they have got to do something about it, about their emissions. Mobilizing finance into CO2 mitigation, because when you put a price on carbon, some money will go back to the, typically go back to the government system, and also in sort of a, being redistributed, especially for supporting CO2 low emission technology. Last one, depending on how you see it, policy stability. A major important national policy which has a policy program which has a impact on global sort of emissions cannot go forward, cannot go ahead without this man's approval. The presidency, as we know, will lead the country for a very long time. As far as I can see, he does strongly support a very aggressive policy approach, a big program like a national ETS. So I think this person, the president, is not particularly well known in other areas, such as human rights. But in environmental, I have to say that a lot of great things have happened under his government, including this one. So policy stability, as long as he continues to be in the office, I think this strong and major policy will stay. All right? Unlike in other countries, such as in Australia, where we see the government scrapping the ETS. Challenges. Carbon intensity targets being used for the national ETS. Without going into great details, I would just say that because it means the CO2 could continue to grow if the GDP grows faster. Free allocation of emission allowances means the polluters don't actually have to pay. And I have to say that New Zealand has experiencing something similar until recently, where there was no, actually, the emission permits were actually freely allocated, which is not what we would recommend. Low quality carbon offset, long story, but that's one of my concerns. All right, as I said, the Chinese version of CDM is one of my sort of concern about whether it's actually contribute to emission reductions. The last one, weak market regulation. A lot of what it can be explained in with different sort of evidence. One of the things that I observed is that many market transactions in the carbon market are not very normal. For example, in my research, this is an internal document that I've got. I am not going to be published. Shows you the transaction records of the carbon offset in one of the Chinese carbon market. The transaction prices, as I circle up there, some of the prices you can see it's actually about the same project, same location, and within 10 days or 1 week. But you see the price, one being, for example, in the middle, the third one and the second one being $10, Chinese yuan, and the other one being 1 cent. That doesn't make sense to me. That in the case, well, there are always some people playing tricks in the markets. The thing is that whether the regulators have done their job. It looks like they haven't, but look, it was 2015, so it's been several years ago. Hopefully they have fixed it. I don't know because I haven't followed up. Pledges before COP26: carbon neutrality by 2060, CO2 to peak by 2030. My concern or questions is that it could, emission trading could contribute to that, but how much to be achieved by carbon offsetting? I would be very concerned about having a large part of it being achieved by carbon offset. Looks like not going to be. Another one is important. What is the peak? CO2 to peak, it could be going to sky high and then falling down, but the sky high levels could contribute to a lot of irreversible damages. And also, how quick the CO2 will move down from the peak level, we don't know. So finally, last year, the government pledged to reduce the CO2 and also to phase out or phase down the coal-fired power generation. But remember, they're not going to stop using it tomorrow. The best they can do is to slow down and hopefully really not going to increase. One of the news reports I came across was us showing in last year, 2020, China actually put up a lot of new coal-fired power capacity into operation. We shouldn't be surprised. After looking at one of the tables that I showed you, actually this is an ongoing trend, generating more electricity from coal fire. I think the question will be how much more and whether they are actually slowing down. Don't expect China to stop using coal in the next 5 years. Our best hope will be in the next 10 years. So, conclusions. In the past several decades, we've seen the change in the ways that environmental issues are understood, from using a science framing to a more development-related or relevant framing. From relying on CNC command and control measures to increasing use of market-based approaches, from being very defensive and hostile towards the Western countries' call for action, to more recently being much more active and cooperative in the international climate change areas. From focusing on the domestic situations to taking global leadership and also looking after the environmental issues in other countries as well. There are strong top-down forces, but there are also greater role for the markets. Is it good for the environment? These are new directions, but do they really drive sort of a change towards a better environment? I can't really tell at this stage, because it's more like a mixed bag. I see something good, I see something bad. At this point, we can't be conclusive. So that's all from me today.
Thank you very much, Alex, for that very comprehensive run-through of the situation in China. And we've asked Nacy Chen, Member of Parliament, to make a few comments, and then we'll take some questions. Okay, so thanks, Nacy. Thanks. Yeah. Oh, yes, sorry.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, Alex, for everything. Tēnā koutou katoa, ngā mihi kia koutou. It's a great pleasure to come and join all of you at the Fabian Society this afternoon or evening here in Wellington. Just got off the plane. A few remarks. I think this is very timely. I mean, especially in terms of COP26 just finishing. I think New Zealand and we as a much smaller nation, for me, I guess, in being in Parliament right now, at the forefront of my mind is how do we exude more influence than we are in size. And I think today Alex has showed us a lot of not only what China has done in such a big capacity, but I think our relationship between New Zealand and China, in that relationship we can definitely build more influence. We always talk about China influencing New Zealand, but I think we need to have the audacity, dare I say, or we need to have the courage or to know that we also have influence over China. And I think that in our, no matter whether it's in our emission trading scheme or in other areas in terms of environmental issues, we're not perfect. perfect, but I do think that we can encourage China to be better as well. So I think today, I guess my contribution and reflection of what Alex has said is that we definitely can influence China in that area. One particular area that I personally have a huge interest in is actually solar energy. So I'm glad you alluded to the solar energy that China has, the technology advancement, and I do think that that is something China and New Zealand can actually work a lot better on, in terms of no matter whether it's importing their technology or whether it's the scale that they've used it and the ways that they've industrialized their solar energy sector. I think that is something for New Zealand to catch up on. So that's definitely something I would love to hear more from you, Alex, but also something I'd love to continue that conversation with you as well. So thank you very much.
Sure. Thank you. Okay. Thanks, Nancy. All right, any questions? Yes, Francis.
Thank you, that's great, great talk. I'm just curious about, because the tension between US and China and Japan and China, so there are actually a lot of factory or business moved away from China now. So basically, I don't really see the emissions going to get worse, but what do you think, like politically, domestically, because a lot of people lose jobs. So in terms of policy stability, I wonder how stable that will help the Chinese government. But as a whole, globally, do you actually see that we're going to make a huge difference? I mean, is it going to be a big difference when we just have a lot of factories move to India or Vietnam or different countries, still pollute, still create the bad effect to the environment, basically just spread it out? Is that going to make a huge difference, or just concentrate? Well, I guess for Chinese will be the air will be cleaner, and less jobs. I don't know. What do you think?
Right. Yeah, I think that's a good point. Sometimes we call this issue as carbon leakage, meaning that the polluters or polluting plants or units moving to another place without actually reducing the pollution. So that would not be this outcome that we want to see. And especially given that, as I've sort of talk about that, in terms of climate change, especially with a emission trading scheme operating across the whole country, most of those polluters are going to be regulated. So if they move out, that means, for example, going to a countries without such regulation, that would mean they lose the regulations, and that's not the whole we want to see. So even though if we don't speak for China's economic interests, we might want them to stay in China so that they continue to be regulated, especially when the alternative countries are not being regulated in the same way. So potentially staying in country will be good, but that's something not easy to control, as I can see. So I don't have the statistic to tell me whether that's really happening in what scale, but carbon leakage is always a concern to us.
Yes, Rafe?
Thank you very much, Alex. Great to hear your talk. It seems to me that what you've set out is a fascinating transition, partly in which you see China copying the West in terms of economic growth, and perhaps leading it in terms of renewable energy growth, and picking up on market environmentalism with emissions trading. So three big ideas there, growth, environmentalism, market environmentalism, and renewables. But the big transition that I see the West starting to take is from a concern with economic growth to a concern with well-being, a shift from growth to well-being. And that requires a certain level of income to be achieved, I think. Do you see that beginning to happen in China, that shift from growth to well-being? And is that one of the areas in which New Zealand can help influence China?
I think we started to see that in some part of the country, especially in major cities, but I'm not quite sure in those disadvantaged rural areas. As you said, this has something to do with people's wealth and their obviously the money that they've got. In major cities, they have got increasing incomes. If that contributes to well-being, then I would suppose the well-being has got some improvement in major cities, but not across the whole country. There are still a lot of poor people in certain part of China, So certainly not for those places. But perhaps, given what you said, because we do see a market's environmentalism here in China, and that is going to cover the entire country. And that has already covered the entire country under different programs. So that would mean, at least in certain places in the country, that you see the markets growing, environmental markets, but not a great improvement in well-being. That's what I assume.
Okay, thanks, Kay.
But I think that China has been complimented by the United Nations for reduction in poverty efforts, which it has done very effectively. I think that needs to be noted. I know there's been a huge amount of criticism from Western countries about Xinjiang and all that, but there are reasons to disbelieve that. I've done a lot of studying of that. And in fact, China has been putting a lot of effort into reducing poverty in that very area. So I'd just like to...
Okay.
Behind, sorry, yes, you may.
Alex, thanks very much for the talk. I was wondering whether you had any reflections on whether you think China hosting the UN Convention on Biological Diversity COP next year will have any impact kind of on the system or the structure, particularly with the sort of large international spotlight that it would bring onto China. When I was living in Beijing, working on climate change policies and NGOs, I kind of learned actually a lot of the large or prominent environmental NGOs or organizations in China actually found their birth in the wake of Beijing hosting the World Women Conference in 1995 in the kind of space that opened up, which have come on to be quite significant operating in China. Just thinking that this CBD COP next year in Kunming is going to be kind of the next big international kind of spotlight or international conference that China is hosting, and whether you think there might be any kind of systemic or important ramifications that happen domestically in China as a result of them hosting the conference.
I am less familiar with biodiversity and nature conservation, but I tend to be more positive. Part of the reason that I've been positive is that because biodiversity and nature conservation are relatively less sensitive to the Chinese government, and even less than greenhouse gas emissions, which is related to the economic growth. So I would suppose, or I would expect the Chinese government be more active in taking leadership in this area. As I said, the Chinese government is very keen on taking leadership on those environmental areas. It's not just about climate change. Global biodiversity and nature conservation are actually one of these areas. But exactly whether they could actually make a difference, I can't tell. But given that they are obviously decided to run a major sort of a international event on their land, I think they have some ambitions. And in the case of China, if they are really ambitious in doing something with strong support from top government officials, they might be able to do it.
Thank you. Okay, Perce, well, take you first and then we'll wrap up.
That was very good. Like as an old chemical engineer, I've had something to do with dealing with effluents from factories and either filtering them or doing various other things. Do you know if there's any work being done on scrubbing the gases that are going up the chimneys? Particularly when you end up with acid rain, one would expect to be able to spray salt water in and get an awful lot of the SO2 caught before it goes out into the atmosphere. Do you know of anything being done in that direction?
Cold generation.
Yes.
Not the technical aspect. Yeah, because the only thing I know is that I think, I can't remember whether I show one of the graphs, maybe I skip it without knowing that. It's actually, the statistics shows the SO2 and also NO2 as well, NOx as well, have gone down. So I assume China has done quite a lot in fixing or upgrading their power plants. So that's why we saw sort of the SO2 and also NOx going down as well. I don't know exactly which technologies they used, but from what I know, it's much better than in the past, especially since about 8 or 9 years ago.
Okay, all right. Right, well, just to conclude, I'd like again to thank you very much, Alex and Nasib, particularly Alex. I do think, given China's size and importance, gaining understanding about China and what it's doing and what it might do is crucial to our understanding as well, and the opportunities that it poses for us and our interventions. And I think beside the market forces that you spoke of, Alex, I think there's also, we need to be aware of the consumer forces in China. And given you're starting with the city pollution in the cities, I remember visiting Shenzhen as a guest of the party and being taken to the tallest building in Shenzhen and invited to look at all the sites of the city and its growth, except I couldn't see a one of them. And I had to decide whether I say how wonderful they are or whether I point out the fact that I can't see them, which was a tricky decision. The other thing is I'd listened this morning to a couple of professors at the University of Southern California talking about how there's a WeChat app called Smelly Pools, which is distributed widely throughout China, so the people can, if they see a smelly pool in their neighborhood, they can notify the local government and the next bit. And as you said, if the governors and the government aren't meeting their targets, they don't make their promotion. So there is, I think, also a powerful consumer movement. And of course, when you're talking about 1.4 billion people, you're talking about a great deal of consumers. Anyway, so thank you very much, Alex. That's very much appreciated. And thank you, Nasi, and thank you all for coming. So, and that's it. Right. All right.